Good evening and welcome to PEGASYS Memories. I'm Melegrito-Palmer, your host. Tonight my special guest is Beth Saulnier.
I am editor-in-chief of Cornellians, which is Cornell's online alumni publication. And I've actually been at Cornell counting Cornell Alumni Magazine it'll be 30 years next summer. So before that I was at the Ithaca Journal, and then I went to basically Cornell Alumni Publication.
What is the origin of Take Two?
Oh boy. So back in the early 90s, when I was 4 or 5 years old, no, I was not. I was 20. I was 20 something, early 20s. I was in the Moonshadow Tavern, which at that time was the journalist bar in Ithaca. So it was owned by a gentleman who was a former radio reporter for WHCU. It was steps away from the Ithaca Journal newsroom and also the Ithaca Times newsroom. And reporters and editors would gather there more nights than I should probably admit. And also the person who's the radio stringer for the NPR affiliate and News Center 7 folks from the TV news. Mm-hmm. And one night in walked Bryan VanCampen. May he rest in peace now, yes, as you know. And he and I got to arguing about movies. And we both argued and we agreed. And it was interesting.
And that was the first time you met?
I'd never met him before. And he was introduced to me because he, of course, was the film critic for the Ithaca Times for many, many years. And I had been the film critic for my college paper at Vassar and at a weekly paper where I worked after school in Massachusetts. And so he and I started arguing, and I remember that we agreed that we had both loathed the movie E.T. And I was 12 years old when I saw E.T., and I remember distinctly hoping that his heart light would go out because the thing was so schmaltzy, and I was a kid watching like Gandhi and Out of Africa, and E.T. I just thought was far too sentimental, and I can't remember what movie we disagreed about. But we had this really fascinating conversation, and Bryan contacted his childhood best friend, Paul Smith, and said, "You got to move back to Ithaca. I want to do a TV show with this woman." And that was how it started.
Good evening and welcome to the premiere episode of Take Two, the movie review program for Tompkins County. I'm Bryan VanCampen.
Lethal Weapon 3 is, of course, the third movie in the Lethal Weapon series. It reunites Mel Gibson as the stark raving maniac of a cop, Martin Ray.
And at that time, I wasn't even the film critic for the Ithaca Journal. I just started doing Take Two at that time, and the publisher of the Ithaca Journal saw it and said, "Why isn't she doing this for us?" And so Take Two actually got me my column at the Ithaca Journal, which lasted about 25 years. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. But after not very long, we ended up being kind of the Siskel and Ebert of Ithaca.
Alrighty then. Welcome to Take Two, the movie review show for people who love movies so much that they'll actually pay to see them in places like New Iberia, Louisiana, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm calling this How I Spent My Summer Vacation. I'm Bryan VanCampen, film critic for News Center 7 and the Ithaca Times.
And I'm Beth Saulnier, film critic for the Ithaca Journal. Okay, well, our friend Bryan here has been off chasing babes in Fort Lauderdale and misbehaving himself in the French Quarter of New Orleans. So
that's what I get for telling
we're playing catch up now, and we're going to review some summer movies that came out a while ago, and we're sorry about that, but Bryan was too drunk to get on the air before this. He was wearing a thong-back bikini.
Okay.
Mission Impossible. Perhaps you might have heard of it. You probably don't want to hear about it now, but hey, we haven't reviewed it yet, so click, click. What's that sound? It's channels changing all over Tompkins County.
Stop it.
Mission Impossible.
And we did around 450 shows,
yes,
almost all of them live from right in this studio where we are every Monday evening at, I think it was at 8 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of the only fish in a small but interesting pond, I guess you could say, because we became kind of local celebrities. It was a little bit crazy.
I remember.
We would go to Wegmans and people would recognize us from the TV show. People would ask us about movies. We would get invited to do the Ithaca Festival. Like we got invited.
You were really celebrities.
It was
in
funny.
Ithaca.
I mean, we got invited to have guest spots in a play at the Firehouse Theater where we came in at the end. We had cameos in our underpants, literally in our underpants. And it was just this crazy thing. But I'll tell you, one of the funniest thing is, one of the people who was a fan of Take Two is the man to whom I am now married and have been now for years. And when we started dating, he said, I knew him from graduate school at Cornell, so he kind of knew me vaguely from that. But then he watched the show, little knowing that we would be
become
married.
a fan of the show.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he was a fan of the show.
I know that you did a lot of your programs here in the studio, but did you have other locations where you did your programs? Can you remember those places?
We did a bunch of things from kind of all over the place. We do special editions. We did the Ithaca Festival. I remember in inflatable chairs that were Star Wars inflatables. We sat in the Commons. We taped a show from the mini golf in Cortland. We did a live show. We did an anniversary show, might have been our 100th show from the Firehouse Theater with an invited audience. Like we sold tickets and people came to that. I remember, I don't actually remember doing it, but after Bryan passed away and Paul Smith did this absolutely amazing video tribute that slayed me, absolutely slayed me. And one of the things that he had from it was a show that we taped we taped from Bryan's dad's house in Cayuga Heights. So here we were in Bryan's living room. And we also did one from the tiny theater at Fall Creek Pictures that we used to call the Fall Creek Living Room. Yes. We taped a show there. So we did kind of roving shows because Pegasus had the equipment available to bring kind of all over town. So I would say, out of all the 450 shows, maybe there were 24 that were done from other places than this studio.
Right. How did you feel about that? Just taking your portable cameras and
I mean, it was super fun. It mixed it up. Bryan and I both had backgrounds in theater. We were both total hams. We'd both done theater in school. We'd both done kind of community theater stuff at different times. And so it was really fun and a different challenge to do it in front of a live audience. And I think we did some question and answer things at Ithaca Festival at different times.
When you were talking about taking your shows outside Ithaca Festival, for instance, now when you brought them back, your show was not a call-in show, but it was a live show.
It was a live show. We were not a call-in show. I cannot imagine how anyone who are survivors of call-in shows, perhaps like yourself, Mimi or certainly Robin, would handle that. But no, we did it live at 8 o'clock so that the feed would go off. We would also be recording it because we would show reruns. So the show would run live and then it would appear other times in the Pegasus schedule. And sometimes we would fix things in post that had been kind of mess ups either. So one of the things that we had that was really unusual, and this is going to be a little bit of a digression, but stick with me. I just happened to read recently the dual biography of Siskel and Ebert that was written by an arts journalist. And it was really moving because it reminded me a lot of my days with Bryan. Yes. But what he noted about the Siskel and Ebert shows, which started off really rudimentarily on PBS in Chicago and kind of became much more sophisticated, but when they started, it was one of the only places where you could see movie previews. There was no internet, there was none of that where you could say, oh, I'm interested in the new Star Wars movie, I want to see the preview, and kind of dial it up and instantly see it. You had to wait for it to appear in the media. And Siskel and Ebert is where it appeared, but it also appeared on Take Two. Because Bryan, as the film critic for New Center 7, was plugged in to get these giant, 3/4-inch tapes of movie previews, the press package that would come for every movie, basically.
As I was saying, I'm a woman and can't be taken for granted.
So we were able to show movie clips in the early 90s at a time when very few people were able to do that. And I didn't understand at that time how special it was, but I think although I flatter myself that people wanted to hear our fascinating and witty repartee and movie commentary, they also got to see scenes from movies in a way that you couldn't see them otherwise.
Right. You said you did this for 11 years?
Yeah, right around, but 10 or 11 years. It was around that much time, from early 90s to early aughts. And 450 episodes is really the thing, because we did it almost every Monday night. And if we weren't going to be in town for some reason, we would pre-tape the episodes. So we would come in, do a live show, stay, and then do the next show that could then be run the following week. So we almost were never not on the air. We would sometimes, so we normally would do 5 movies per episode. So we would have to see 5 movies every week. How
was that for you and Bryan? Because, you have to be good friends.
We were really good friends, and we would see sometimes a triple feature. I was so much younger than I am now, but we would go and see the 7 o'clock show at the mall, the 9 o'clock show at the mall, and then they used to have midnight shows at the mall. And, it was a golden age of movie theaters. Ithaca it was a golden age of movie theaters in Ithaca. Ithaca had the mall, multiplex. It had Fall Creek Pictures. It had Cinemapolis. So together that was 5 screens.
Right.
And Cornell Cinema was in its heyday, streaming, and there were VHS, but it was DVDs, very much pre-Netflix. So Cornell Cinema had its cinema in Willard Strait, and then it also would show movies in other places like Uris Hall. So there were, on any given night, if you do the math, maybe as many as 18 live movie screens showing films in this little town in upstate New York.
Now, did you and Bryan go to Moonshadow? I remember Moonshadow Bar. I remember all the people. So did you go there and had your discussions about the movies afterwards, and then have the people participate?
No, Mimi, we had a rule where Bryan and I would not talk about a movie we saw until we were on this set.
Wow.
Because we didn't want to leave all our good stuff off the tape. We would almost we would go to a movie and we would come out of it and we would be kind of buzzing with our opinions.
Yes.
And what we thought the other person thought about this movie, but we would just zip it because we wanted it to be fresh and real when we reviewed it on the show.
You think of some movies that you had to include in take 2 that you felt like, it wasn't.
So many things. Mimi, when we were seeing 5 movies a week, it really sometimes felt like work. I remember the first time Bryan and I walked out of a movie together, and then we admitted on the show. It was called Dr. Giggles, I believe.
I don't remember.
Or maybe I think we didn't walk out of the first Leprechaun movie, but we wanted to. There were definitely. So we hated films together. I think we agreed more often than not.
I think that's the reason that your show stood, 11 years?
Yeah, 44 and 50 episodes.
Amazing.
I feel like we agreed more often than we disagreed. But when we disagreed, it was more fun. When we would take up kind of contrary positions. We were coming from it. Bryan was kind of a quintessential fanboy. Bryan had every piece of Beatles, Yellow Submarine memorabilia. Yellow Submarine, okay.
Oh, that's
that was Bryan's favorite movie, and I hated that movie so much. And so I think we took great pleasure in our different positions. I thought it was the stupidest movie that you could not possibly enjoy if you were not high as a kite. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
That would have been an interesting show when you did it.
I'm sure we did Yellow Submarine. In our episode, I'm tripping over my tongue. Our episode about the movies we love the most, I'm sure Bryan did Yellow Submarine.
Yes.
And so that made me finally see Yellow Submarine, which I had avoided seeing for my entire adult life. And I was like, who thinks this movie was a good idea that is not stoned out of their mind on the devil's lettuce?
Right. You talked about E.T.
Yes.
I'm curious to find out from you. E.T. kind of turned you off as a movie?
Well, I saw E.T. when I was 12 years old. I thought, I'm not a huge Spielberg fan.
Oh, okay.
I often found his stuff superly over-sentimental, Don't Get Me Started on Saving Private Ryan. Not the middle of it. The middle of it is a masterpiece. The framing, the beginning, the end. Trust your audience. Good Lord. But yeah, I can't quite remember why the 12-year-old Beth Saulnier hated E.T. so much, except I just remember thinking it was incredibly sappy. And, you know.
So when you ended your 11 years, what did you do then? I mean, it must have been really a challenge for the two of you, because did you decide, both of you?
I moved out of town.
Oh, that was the reason.
I moved out of town for a brief and unfortunate experiment in matrimony.
Well, that was when you went to New York
I
City.
moved to New York City for a boy, and then I moved back because of the boy.
Yeah.
And so it was a natural stopping point because I moved away. And
But
then
you
when
decided not to do it anymore.
Well, then when I moved back, I did start my column up again, but Take Two was a weekly column is a slog, and a weekly live TV show is also a big commitment. It's like seeing the 5 movies a week. I only needed 1 movie for a column. I needed 5 for the TV show to keep it fresh. And every Monday night, come hell or high water or bad weather, coming down to the studio and taping it. It was a thing. It had about a decade, and it was wonderful. But I don't think that every wonderful thing you did in your 20s and early 30s you necessarily want to do in your 40s and 50s.
That's true. Well, Paul, of course, was your producer, right?
And director.
Yeah. And do you remember working with other people or interviewing maybe?
No, we didn't interview people. It was very much a Siskel and Ebert format, where Bryan and I. It wasn't a free-for-all. We had, I can't even remember what you called it, but there was a technical name for it. We would agree, Bryan and I would agree, which one of us was going to open the show and toss it to the other person.
Yes.
And then that person would introduce the first movie. And then we would alternate. So we would pick which person was going to introduce the movies. We would have the film clips chosen. And so we would go to camera, we would introduce the clip, and we would give a context for the clip so that it didn't come out of nowhere. And then after it came back from the clip, we would give our feeling about the movie. And then the other one would give their opinion of the movie, and then the gloves were off, and we would argue about it. But we had to keep it tight, because we had to go to the next movie, and sometimes Paul would give us a sign like, you're going over on this movie, you have to move to the next one. We didn't want to give any of the movies short shrift.
Right.
So we had to make sure that we had to shut our damn mouths, even if we wanted to keep yelling at each other.
I remembered watching one of your shows, and I think Robin and me, and I said, boy, they don't even argue about the movies. Like, it was one of those where you were talking about 2 or 3 movies, and you and Bryan were in sync.
We were, I think, more often than not, because I think we both loved movies. One thing about the two of us was that we each loved all kinds of movies. We weren't the folks who said, well, I love art house movies in French, but don't give me a superhero movie.
Yes.
I love a period drama, but I can't sicken myself with science fiction. We love it all. We loved it all, and we still do. Bryan, I'd like to think that wherever Bryan is right now, he's
smiling.
He's got a all access pass to every festival.
Right. I understand when you were in college in Vassar that you also did movie reviews. You also wrote. Right?
Well, I only wrote. I wasn't part of the TV station. This was the late 90s in Poughkeepsie.
Yes.
No, Saulnier on Cinema, my column that was in the Journal for about 25 years, started at Vassar when I was an undergrad.
Oh, okay.
So I wrote it there for 2 or 3 years. I did a weekly movie review.
What brought you to Ithaca, by the way?
Grad school.
Oh,
so
okay.
I started a master's program at Cornell, which I did not finish. It was in communication.
Oh, okay.
And I matriculated there. I was a teaching assistant for a class, a writing for media class, but I just wasn't the right program for me. And I left and I started working at the Ithaca Journal kind of the next week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Now, what do you think of PEGASYS today?
Golly,
And what is the future? I mean, do you have any?
I am not the right person to ask about it. I hardly watch. I mean, as you and I had chatted about before we started recording, I don't even live in Ithaca half the year
true.
now. I'm a snowbird in a 55+ community in Central Florida.
You are the babies in the community.
Yes, we are the youngest kids. I'm not even quite 55, but my husband is. I'll be 55 in a couple of months.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, I just think PEGASYS is such a force for good. And it was then and it is now. And I feel like it deserves to be invested in by everyone who, whether it is the cable company who may be doing nothing more than their minimum required allotment of resources. But I remember very clearly and happily the heyday of Pegasus. So when we were doing Take Two, this place was absolutely bustling.
Yes.
And we would sometimes get in hot water. If something came up and we had to cancel our slot at kind of the last minute, we would get like a demerit on our permanent record because other people wanted that slot, and we were doing a disservice to the community if we didn't actually show up and do our show when we said we were going to. I remember when there were at least 3 people on the full-time staff paid access facilitators, not counting Lauren Stefanelli, who was the director. There were people coming and going. You ran into everybody you knew in the local government who were doing community affairs things and arts affairs things, and
What do you think happened? Because, I remember those days as well,
I think social media happened.
Oh, okay.
It used to be that if you wanted to record a professional quality show, you needed this facility's equipment and staff. Now everybody has a video production facility in their back pocket, and people can tape shows using their video editing tools on their various devices. I'm a total amateur. I don't do that kinds of stuff myself. But for example, I have friends who are professional actors and they need to record their audition tapes. And this is a pretty controversial thing for the acting community. I'm not saying that this is great, that they should have to do this. But they can produce something beautiful
and send it
with a tripod and an iPhone and a backdrop, and edit it themselves and send it out. So I think that's what happened. People don't need the facility like they did back in the day.
Whoa, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So much.
I hope you can edit this into something useful.
Thank you for joining us. And again, I'm Melegrito-Palmer. Good night.